All right, First Chronicles 18, let's call this one Before You Fight, because in this chapter we are going to see the way in which God carried through on his promise to subdue David's enemies before him. And a number of those enemies are going to be the Philistines, the Moabites, and the Syrians, and also I think the Edomites toward the end of the chapter. And they're all going to fight for different reasons. Some are going to fight out of fear. Moab, when they partnered to try to hire Balaam against Israel, they were actually afraid, even though they were relatively close relatives to the Israelites. The Philistines and the Syrians might have been a little bit different. The Syrians at a point in time had actually become an instrument of God's judgment. And so they might have gotten used to doing what they wanted because they were fighting under God's power, even if they weren't technically God's chosen people. And the Philistines, after a while, had gotten used to sunning Israel. And so even though Israel, as God had originally planned it out of Egypt, when they were established as a nation, they should have had authority over nations like the Philistines. Once they began to stray in the judges, those roles were reversed, and the Philistines got used to lording over Israel. And so once it became clear that Israel could be restored to what they should have been, the Philistines were not willing to let them out of little brother status. And so these nations all seem to fight for different reasons, but they stand in a stark contrast to one king in particular. In this chapter, he's called Two. Previously, we've seen him described as Toy, and he is a king who chose not to fight. Why? Because he had a common enemy with David in the Syrians. And once he heard that David defeated the Syrian army, he simply sent gifts and messengers of peace. And so Two gives us another example of what we saw back in chapter 14 with Hiram, who, when he heard that David had become king, simply sent gifts and messages of peace to help David actually recover from his mistake in getting Uzzah killed. And so David didn't invade those kings. And so he wasn't simply on a mission to conquer all of the nearby territories. And so the thing that none of the nations that chose to fight with David seemed to consider was whether or not it's the right thing to do. Because sometimes the simple questions are the ones that can keep us out of a lot of trouble, because a lot of these nations, as we're going to see in the next chapter, are not simply going to be defeated. Instead of making David their servant, they're actually going to go into the service of David and the children of Israel, helping us to understand this, that in the case of nations, much like Syria, who had once been an instrument of God's judgment, there is a point at which you can continue to feel like you're working under God's power when you are simply carrying forward on his momentum, understanding that he even told his people Israel that as you were clearing out the Canaanites, it's because of the things that they did that defiled the land. Therefore, if you repeat those things, God will evict you too. And so even though they were able to carry forward for a certain time in the land, lacking the kind of integrity that it took to keep the land, the dilemma that they were in, I don't think is a whole lot different than ones we face. Why? Because when we are winning, things like integrity can seem super square or burdensome. But the tough question that we all have to answer is, how long can we really keep winning without integrity? And so even though I keep bringing that issue of integrity up over and over again, it's not coming out of the blue. It's because it is the question that ended up causing nations to stumble. Nations like the Philistines, the Edomites, the Moabites, and the Syrians, as we see in this chapter, who moved forward, quite possibly thinking they were still operating under God's power when they were really simply on the last stages of his momentum. Once David came to power, learning the hard way, the answer to the question, how long can you keep winning without integrity?